afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on bringing African feminist thought to bear on artificial intelligence and data governance. Delighted that we are joined by Ololade Faniyi and Irene Mwendwa. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Just a few ground rules for how this is going to go, a few points of introduction, and then I'll hand over to our speakers. So this webinar series is part of our research development program here at the Ethics Lab, which looks to bring the African humanities into conversation with the ethical questions posed by new and emerging health technologies. And webinars are one part of the community building that we do to tackle some of these questions. We also organize, host academic retreats, academic residencies, and provide funding for catalyst grants for small projects ranging anywhere from say 6 to 12 months. These opportunities are currently open to application. So if you've got, if your work is positioned, or if you're looking to explore conversations at the intersection of Africa, ethics, and emerging technology, we'd love to hear how we can collaborate and support your work. Our speakers today are going to speak together for about half an hour, and then we'll open up the conversation to comments and questions. Just to please note that this event is being recorded. I do still hope that when it's time for a general discussion, you would put on your camera to interact with our speakers. But that's also understandable if you prefer to keep your camera off. Please do keep mute your microphone so as not to interrupt the flow of conversation. So I'm very delighted to welcome Ololade Faniyi, who is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Emory University, where she explores the relationship between critical technology studies and African feminisms. And she focuses on Afro-feminist decolonial reimaginations of Euro-American and Chinese techno-capital overrepresentations. She's also currently the Gender and Feminisms editor at the Pan-African platform, The Republic, in addition to being a graduate fellow with the Atlanta Interdisciplinary Artificial Intelligence Network, as well as a co-director for the Imagining America Publicly Active Graduate Education Fellowship. Irene Mwendwa is a lawyer working to create safer digital futures through research and advocacy in tech policy and data governance. She's an experienced legal professional with extensive experience in innovative collaborations across public, private, and civil society sectors. Irene structures and executes projects that deliver better policies and legal frameworks on public policy issues such as elections and technology. And she's a builder of liberatory futures rooted in integrity, imagination, and justice. Very delighted to welcome you both to see how to at least to explore ways of bringing African feminist thought as an ethical archive and how we think about AI ethics and data governance. So thank you very much. Welcome, and over to you.
Hi, thank you, Anya. Thank you so much for having us. Since we have 30 minutes, I'm going to begin and talk about, and since our topic was from theory to praxis, and so we're going to show you in an half an hour how Irene and my work merge, and how at the center of this relation, brings us to African feminist imaginings of technology. So I would start by asking, and I know it's not time for Q&A, but it's more of a rhetorical question of what's our continent's relation to technology, to AI, to data governance. And Irene and a lot of African feminists who happen to do tech work would answer that question by saying the relationship currently is filled with it's extractive, it's exploitative. And we can begin from even the very internet connection, the very cables that bring internet connection as it is right now to the continent, and what they bring with them. They bring debt dependency. They are mapped onto histories of enslavement. They wrap all of this, capitalist expansions in names of abolitionists to kind of wrap it up and say, okay, we're bringing a cable that is bringing debt to the African continent, but we're going to call it Equiano, as a way to just wrap that up. We know the experiences of content moderators on the continent, and especially a lot of narratives that are overrepresented about the experiences of data labelers, of content moderators, of tech workers. A lot of it still doesn't tell you to what extent it is fundamentally gendered. And so the experiences of African women in these spaces is something that a lot of us still don't know. We talk about reproductive surveillance, whereas as we start to get a lot of right-wing waves of anti-abortion rights, anti-queer rights onto the continent, all of these things begin to map onto the technologies that women use to track their periods. I work with people in Zambia, with a collective in Zambia, who have started to think beyond some of these common applications that women use to track their periods, especially when the state is giving some inclinations that we might soon start to see reproductive surveillance on women through these technologies. And so that begins the question of, what's our relation to data itself? We see policy tensions, and Irene could speak to you for 5 hours on that alone. We see tech facilitated violence against women, where I was over June this year, I was with the feminist tech organization in Nigeria, TechHa, and they tell you stories of really, really violent tech facilitated violence against women that gets swept up, where they talk particularly about an instance where they had to reach out to the owner of Telegram. And Telegram is one technology that there's a lot of attention in the last year about how Facebook and Instagram and Twitter took off content moderation practices, and that becomes like an anxiety for a lot of African feminists about how do we keep ourselves safe on these platforms. But Telegram is this often ignored, extremely violent space that a lot of tech facilitated violence happens that a lot of us don't even pay attention to, because the bigger attention is on, the big three, so to speak. We talk about an internet culture that is filled with hate, that is filled with misogyny. And so all of these things are just ways to help tease out our current relation to technology. Now, when we think about the shiny side, the good side, where we're talking about tech brings wealth, outside of finance and outside of payment technologies, how many technologies in our encounter, that encounter the continent, have our visions encoded in them? How many technologies have what would look like what an African vision of technology would look like, outside of all of the payment and fintech technologies that are being created because of our lack of internet connection and the ways people share money and so on and so forth. And so fundamentally, a lot of when we think about technology, we close our eyes and think about technology. It's often encoded in the imaginary of Europe, America, and China. And so that begins to bring a lot of conversation about even our national policies, even the African Union's current digital transformation strategy itself often responds to tensions and pushes from all of these tech empires. And many times it's not something that is it's at its core indigenous in terms of this is an African way, or this is an African feminist way of what technology can be when it's centered on communal relationships, on communal ownerships, on sovereignty, on care, and centered on a technology that does not harm people. And I would center on a particular experience, because when we particularly center the experiences of content moderators in Kenya, and a lot of times we think about it as a Kenyan issue, but a lot of content moderators in Kenya are removed from their own spaces and are brought to Kenya, because Kenya in this moment in time has emerged as this convening space. And so in Kenya, you have content moderators from Nigeria, from South Africa, from Somali, from Rwanda, from the Congo, from the DRC, from everywhere. And they all gather in this space, brought by this, third-party companies to do the often underpaid work of labeling these technologies that we know of. And so I was last 2 weeks ago, there was a conversation on Twitter, the Nigerian tech journalist platform, Tech Cabal, put out a tweet and said, Nigeria's next big export, and by extension, it was referring to Nigeria, and by extension, the continent, was that the next big export is not oil, but AI computing power. And that made me pause, because when we say AI computing power, it begs the question of what does that even mean? And based on all of the things I've spoken about earlier about our relation to technology, we know from the past several years that our AI computing power means Africans doing the unwanted entry-level data labeling tasks. We know that that's what AI computing power means. We know that they are being made cheap labor under surveillance, where we know that, and so when we start to talk about our next big export is AI computing power, can we pull back a little to focus on the actual need to protect our data sovereignty? Can we focus on the actual need to let go of this fear of being left behind AI race that empires are pushing us to, and we feel like we're being left behind and we have to hustle and struggle without thinking about how it's harming our continent and our citizens as well. And especially when this AI race only serves imperial interests. And so one of the core conversations or core themes that emerge in my interactions with African feminist tech organizers, policy advocates, and so on and so forth, technologists as a shorthand, is one theme that emerges across the different contexts I engage in Kenya, in Nigeria, and in Zambia, is that we need to offer our own solutions, because those who cannot see us who are not us cannot see us, and therefore cannot imagine solutions for our issues. And so because my own work is fundamentally African feminist, I'm seeing patterns here that we cannot sidestep. So for instance, Lagos also is being touted, especially with a lot of attention to Kenya. Lagos is being touted right now as another space where big tech can settle and bridge the digital divide. Now, the historian Ademide Adeluyi would ask us to pull back from Lagos. And beyond the gentrification of Lagos itself, she would argue that Lagos is wounded by enslavement, by colonialism. And a lot of these things were bombarded and built over. So when you dig the very foundation of what we understand Lagos to be right now, you see the wounds, and these wounds have not been healed. And the digital is mapping onto all of these wounds that have not been healed. And when we talk about spaces like South Africa also, the scholars like Ugo Kanam will remind us that there's a different perspective of being Black that we see in spaces like South Africa, being Black and indigenous, and what this brings us to confront in terms of colonialism and imperialism and racial capitalism. And so what happens when you center the experiences of African Black people in terms of our relation to technology, and especially the experiences of African Black women when it comes to technology? And so beyond the bridging the digital divide narrative, my work unpacks the very logic of who is human, who is included and who is excluded, and how is technology itself constructed on this singular vision that is white, that is male, that is capitalist, and how does this vision push a particular definition of who is considered human? And here, when I'm thinking about what human means, I'm thinking about who has the capacity for being harmed. Because in a normal, sane environment, we shouldn't even be talking about the harm and the debilitation that African content moderators are experiencing. And so when the human becomes constructed on who has the capacity of being harmed, then we need to pull back and think about what does the human mean in terms of technology. And so we start, and not just the capacity, and not just who is capable of being harmed, because they're human, but a lot of the time harm in the definition of big tech, harm is often read, not because people are human, but because it harms capitalism. And so they think of them in terms of resources for capitalism, as opposed to the matter of fact that they're human beings. And so African feminist thought especially asks us to think in relation. And what does relation mean? It means we connect the threads. What does the child labor and the sexual violence happening to around mining of cobalt and coltan in Congo have in connection with the experiences of women content moderators, or the debilitation of content moderators in Kenya? What does it have to do with the expansion of Chinese smart cities, where, as we know, a lot of journalistic inquiry into this has shown that these technologies in the hands of authoritarian governments are being retooled to surveil and punish women and journalists. And so what do all of these things have in relation? And this we see are different nodes of what scholars have begun to call digital colonialism. And gender in particular takes a very serious significance when we think about digital colonialism, because we exist in a space where women have been rendered an invisible labor force to enable the extraction of cheap African male labor. And in our contemporary times, and this I'm talking about historical colonialism, where African women as a collective were rendered invisible because to extract African cheap male labor. And so in our contemporary times, as we begin to grapple with contemporary Africans, being contemporary Africans at this point in time of our history, our African women being invisibilized in this tech machine, from content moderators to tech policy advocates to women who are building different ways of connecting and teaching women and other minorities on how we need to rely on different visions of technology altogether. And I've had the pleasure of working, for instance, with people like Andara Mola, who herself is building a different social media, a different way to relate with people, a different kind of social media that redefines our relationships with one another, because we're human beings, period. And so I have begun to thinking closely with African feminist scholars like Lynn Osome, like Philomena Chioma Steady, and like Patricia McFadden about what it means to be a feminist human implicated in this structure. And this structure often brings us as feminist humans, as African feminist humans, often because of these violent encounters, but also through the fact that African feminism forces us or compels us to be in relation, to not think of just the individual, but think of ourselves as a group. And so what does it mean in this space to be feminist human, reimagining technology from the margins? Another African feminist scholar, Iyanja Yabola, asks us in an interview with the Republic that what would AI look like if it was built by an African woman who had to walk to get water? And I extend that question in my own work by asking, how does technology produce hierarchies of the human, where, as I said before, today the human is being defined by who is capable of being harmed? And how can we look to African feminism and the work of African women who are facing some of the most violent material consequences of digital colonialism of the continent? How can we look to them for different visions of the technological human? And what would it mean to look beyond the celebrated center to the margins, where African women are showing us what technology would and can look like if and when it's designed by those who are currently being most harmed by it? And this work has brought me in close relation with people like Irene and some of the other women I had mentioned, and we have become partners in this, and not the relation of researcher and research subject. And what emerges from this is something that is fundamentally beautiful, because it takes theory and praxis and brings them together, where our continent's current relation to technology forces us into a group with a shared identity of exclusion. And so when we begin to think about how African feminism enables us to think in networked ways, to think in decolonial ways, to think in intersectional ways, we start to see what does it mean to reimagine technology when the infrastructure and the governors, and when I say governors, I mean everybody from the social media platforms to the owners of the AI technologies and all of that. What does it mean to reimagine and think in these structures when the governors itself, when they resist your existence as an African woman? And so I'm going to turn over to Irene here to show us what African feminist practice looks like from our work doing tech policy advocacy and so on. Hi, Irene.
Hi very much. Hi, everyone. My screen is coming up. I'm trying to do a small presentation I always use. It's actually like a mobile presentation that I always just have on my phone to just have some conversations, especially when it comes to um, data governance as a whole. Can you see my screen? Okay, I don't know where
Yes.
I don't know where I'm supposed to click to see it, but it's fine. Let me go on my slide or on my presentation. I am Irene Mwendwa. I am a lawyer by profession and an activist. I am so honored to be in the presence of scientists and my good friend Ololade. Been following her work and some of your work for a while now. However, it also presents to me again that practitioner's response, or how we can all galvanize our efforts, our energies, our time, and our minds to really also shine even in the wake of some of these big or deeply entrenched governance issues, especially when it comes to tech and data policy. The point with which I come, especially in these conversations, most of the time is, of course, to acknowledge the harms, acknowledge what's really happening, but at the same time to realize that as a feminist, especially as an African woman, a young African woman, that I also wield some power, that I'm also part of communities. I'm also a creative one or another. I also sing African folk songs. I read African poetry. I consume a lot of African culture. So it's also important that this is also something that those who are going to come after me are able to find memories of this, archives of this, from a point of, the population is growing, and therefore we need to also use and imagine these technologies to work for us. So that's the regard with which I approach the practitioner's response, even when we are fighting on this other side, that technologies continue to harm us. So just to get into it, and I recognize there are a lot of you who have been focusing in academia. Some of you are teaching, some of you maybe have been in practice as doctors, as public health scientists. So you may not have a lot of resonance to this, but I hope it's going to help you change your mind as I finalize my conversation. But I look at these practices or the response from an African woman's perspective, from a point of at least these folds that you see on the screen, where you can have your own website in whatever capacity, in whatever form you come up with. We can always have our circles of crafting and storytelling and record this into videos and upload them on whatever video tool or video apps that we use, so that again, they're part of that building of community and recognizing that the same work that we are putting on the ground or in contact with communities and in our governments, in our offices, is also going to be part of history that is going to be studied later and recognized. The other tenet I also reflect on is enchanting technology through care, personal autonomy, and I'll get a bit deeper into those. And of course, the bodily and data sovereignty, where of course, you can use your healthcare apps, your health apps on your phones. Last week, I was speaking to a group of people who didn't realize that the health apps on their phones work even when they've not opted in because of some of the sensors or GPS tools in their phones. Then we have things like creating friendships like Ololade and I, web rings or digital gardens, where we just go on calls like this, on webinars, and just talk about this work, which is quite new, especially in the continent, or sometimes it's very difficult to make the point that it's not just about suffering. We're also using the very same tools to share our lives and to experience joy. Solidarity, of course, with very many people who are facing different issues now across the world. Taking time out of technologies. Hello to some of us here who have scheduled off time of their laptops and of their phones or gadgets. I think also I get into a bit of practices on ethics of care, how you speak with one another and engage one another online. And then recognizing emotions and voices and legitimizing our differences. But to just take a deep dive, and I recognize my time is limited, is again, for me, a reflection on really practically reclaiming power from these platforms to us is think about so many existing parallel alternative web tools, applications, you know, your own, some of you who can code from scratch, even creating your own websites, you know, that the one that doesn't look like the ordinary or the mainstream social media apps, it's also something that really reflects on, if 10 or a million people like it, then it means then it's going to be owned up, it's going to be coming from Africa, it's going to be from, you know, from our own realities and experiences. So in this regard, I feel, especially for young Africans, young creators, there are music artists, writers, and cultural curators here who I see doing a lot of work in terms of shifting some of the conversations from the mainstream apps or technologies that we use. And I always go and check out. Sometimes you will see there's an artist here in Kenya, I forget, Nafsi Yangu. Nafsi Yangu means my soul, something. Yeah, it's Swahili for my soul. He's an engineer who is always trying to build something online. And he puts out some of the websites for us to go and test, experience. So I always go on them because he needs our efforts, when we use them, he needs feedback from us. So the same way we go on the mainstream tools and, you know, we see all the issues on the AI owned or the big tech companies, the same regard, we can also reclaim that power to give effort to some of the small or big efforts being made here. So I think, because I can't see the screen now, but I would like to ask all of you, if you're listening to me, who has a personal website? How does it look like? Do you want to share it with us? We'd be happy to look at your personal website and just engage with your work in that regard. So even if you don't have time, I think it's very important, especially if you're an African scientist, in my opinion, to really have your own, so that we can be able to see some of the work you've put out, even if it's not super organized. I know it's very different from the whole academic experience where things have to be a certain way and follow protocols, but there's also a way you can create and curate your work. But then just to go recognizing the same line of work, we know that in history that even when they did not have the current technologies that we use, our ancestors, communities in the past found ways to put together their art in peers or in communities or in groups. So in this regard, just to reclaim that power and to use technology as well, it's the same regard where, for me, as I was explaining earlier, to just reclaim that knowledge and convening power and art and creativity to really ensure that it's being said in our way, in our own language, in our own music, in our own tones, in our own colors, and to really ensure that someone who is reading maybe your website, your work years to come, and is from the continent, is able to see some of the unspoken rules or knowledge that sometimes is not found in mainstream research or books or curriculums or in government conversations, but can be found and can be a useful resource. And this is why I also come up to ask some of you who maybe, if you know of the app or the tool by Yahoo called Tumblr, it's a very good example of how, especially the West, came up to put or came together then to ensure that their cultures are not erased, because it's managed to put a lot of data and resources about how people are using innovation and technology. And then again, I was speaking about friendship rings and community rings, where many women, especially in Africa, from a practitioner's point of view, even when you know maybe you cannot afford LinkedIn, or you sometimes feel like LinkedIn is so overwhelming, and I know I'm not alone here, many people have found ways in which they have conversations, very, very meaningful conversations, even when they're not together in the same country, in the same region. So you can see that technology to date continues to really help us maintain our friendships, maintain our relationships from a point of always addressing challenges we may have, or sometimes watering our gardens. Sometimes it's not a physical garden you're standing on if we all live in apartments, but you nurture something, you grow a conversation with your friend, you grow a blog, you develop, a piece of art together, maybe on an art platform or an app, and you continue building with on that regard, even when you're working on things like phone addiction or app addictions, like some of us here. So it's really also helped us to reflect, especially from a practitioner's perspective, some of the apps or solutions that have come up to reclaim your time, to reclaim your mind or your anxiety or your breath work. You know, I know you all know that there's a lot of work, resources, data and information, especially from an ethical point of view, that has now been used to really enrich a few, even when some of us are sharing on these apps very genuinely and just to grow ourselves and our community. So for me, if we continue building our own here in the continent, then we'll be able to have some that look like ourselves and that serve some of our immediate needs. So that's how, again, balancing from the research and practitioners' point of view, that I ensure that we're able to use technologies to reclaim community. But I think for you all and I always ask this question, what would a digital commons built by Africans, especially on care, how would that look like? And for me, I always reflect on how we moved from, well, not necessarily moving, but how we no longer very much use the 3 stones and firewood, and now we have, say, a gas stove, and we still are able to enjoy cooking in a kitchen. So for me, how does that look like in terms of an app, a social media tool that Africans can also come up with? How simple would that look like? If you're in Kenya and if you're following the Kenya public discourse during the different finance bill or financial year reporting by the budget reporting by our government, our Gen Zs have built tools on the GPTs. Some are just open source tools where people can ask questions, where you can even use sharing to just either make fun or understand what's really happening when it comes or when it regards the national budgeting process. So for me, it has been very, very powerful to see, even if it's not comprehensive, we are there. We are getting there. And finally, or in the end, when we see very elaborate technologies and innovation, it will be some of the small efforts being done in our own communities, in our own countries. But to just finalize my presentation, really, there's a lot of conversations online. There's a lot of worlds that we get into and we're like, oh my God, this feels very utopian. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, just give me a minute.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So some of us, I think we go into conversations sometimes, they are quite, you enter and you say, this doesn't feel like it's in my age group, or I don't think I have the bandwidth or capacity to enter some of these conversations. It's just to recognize that, of course, cultures are changing and there are different subcultures coming up because of the internet, because of some of the language. I think if you have a young child, you hear them now saying 6. When you say 6, they say 7 or 6, 7. So some of these conversations, even when we think we don't understand, I promise you they're all part of building cultures that are going to stand the test of time, especially because we are all, engaging whether we like to or not. So what I know some of us have done, including myself, is that even when we know technologies are here to help us and make our work easier, our lives easier, to also slow down. And some groups have even created tools that help you to really either leave some of the platforms that we no longer like, or we see a lot of hate on, or in the case of what Lola has just said, when we know content moderation in Africa is harmful to fellow Africans, and also some of the apps that we use don't offer content moderation that is very specific to our needs. Some of us have quit some of those platforms. So it's something that is also part of, from a practice point of view, reclaiming your future by saying, if there's another alternative that works, I will use it. Even if there's no other alternative, it's also fine. That slowness, taking time off of some of these apps is also very welcome in terms of using them. But we've also found that there are so many of us who are doing research, collaborative efforts, asking very difficult and random questions about imagining how technologies of hope would look like, so that they're not used to facilitate more harms or facilitate more arbitrary arrest and difficult and very, very, very painful regimes as we've been seeing this past year. So again, a lot of efforts have been done by feminists, especially here in Africa, who've now been writing think pieces, engaging in conversations about how, as Lola put it earlier, that from my notes, these issues are relational, where if there's a war in another continent, it's definitely going to affect us. If there's mining in a country next to us by children, it's definitely going to affect. So in that regard, really using and studying the ways of life and communities and societies, how they're using technologies to also imagine a hopeful future. So you'll find a lot of work by organizations who are doing work around what is called feminist technologies. Feminist technologies, for some of us or who've never heard of it, may sound very utopian, but this is where you say, I will only use, say, health apps or apps for collecting period data or menstruation data or reproductive health data by a woman because it's a woman who understands my experience better, or by experienced, say, professional service providers in that regard, so that we're also not part of spreading a lot of public health misinformation and disinformation as we have been seeing. But just to end, this is usually my last slide, and it comes from a point of reflection. And I hope I've not been boring you guys. I always try to move away from the text. We're always reading from the research, but to ask questions that we can imagine with. When we are sharing online, when we are building our own tools, our own websites, our own knowledge sets, whose aesthetics and voices are still missing from some of these futures, digital futures, especially even when some of you are doing your work in the different labs that you work in. How can the digital community building be a part of feminist care, where, you know, we cannot hurt others when we're engaging online? And what does a decolonial digital commons look like to you? And I'll like to hand that over back to Anye. Thank you so much, and I hope we've been able to follow.
No, thank you both so much for really, I would say, very rich discussion, excellent balance in terms of both theory and intellectual history, but also, I mean, as the title would suggest, sort of what some concrete possibilities for feminist praxis looks like in a digital world. So thank you very much. I'm going to open the discussion for comments and questions. Yeah, so you can just raise your hand and put your mic on and camera, or you're also welcome to put a question in the chat. So yeah, we've got a question from Yantina.
Hi, and thank you so much. Sorry, let me make my screen big. I thoroughly enjoyed that, and there was so much in both of your Ololade and Irene, so much in both of your submissions that as I was listening, I struggled to make sense of. I'm looking forward to listening to your submissions again. So thank you for the generosity with which you've shared. My name is Yantina. I'm also with the Ethics Lab. So thank you. And my question might be not quite so well articulated, but I hope you'll get a sense of where I'm trying to get to. And the idea that I'm playing around with is, so I love the invitation, Ololade, to center imagination as a key way for us to think differently about AI and to center. And I think in the work that we do, we often use the language of another world as necessary, and the work of an ethical imagination to a different kind of future and what that could look like as key to the work that we need to be doing. And I loved, Ololade, how you centered kind of that very clearly in a particular context, right? So you spoke about your embodiment as and your worldly experiences as an African woman, as a Black African woman, as being central to that act of imagining. And so I think I found that very provocative, and then or provocative, I mean, in a good way. And then, Irene, I really enjoyed your more practical grounding in questions like, I mean, I loved all that you said, but also the practical grounding and the questions such as, what would a digital commons built on care look like, which part of the response to that, I guess, is imagination. What would that look like? What could that look like? Especially when we ground it in context in the way that Ololade did. Now, my question comes in with the tension between, and this is, I guess, where, and this is not resolved for me, and I'm asking you because I'd love to hear you both reflect on this question, which is, so the language of imagination and care and justice and social justice and centering that in how we think about technology is like music to my ears. But there's the practical reality of the physicality as well as the current economic arrangements, political arrangements of these technologies that mean that even when we imagine things differently, and even when we use them differently, I mean, this is your challenge is to say, well, let's use these things in ways that tend to care. The reality is we're constrained by the infrastructure, right, of AI, as well as the economic arrangements and political arrangements of AI and how that is shaping our world. And so I'd love to hear you, it's not so much a question, but just I'd love to hear you reflect on that duality. So what is the work of imagining in a world that is this world? And how do you think about that? I hope that's clear. It's a big question, but
Thanks, Santina. Yeah, Irene, Ololade, any initial?
I can start. Do you know, I also was in your shoes at some point, and I also questioned myself and this work and with Lola and my friends, but a group of feminist techies from the Asia Pacific, that's the Indonesia, Fiji, you know, the islands. One time we were seated together and they helped us create a font from scratch. And we were able to call the font whatever name we loved. So for me, I kept thinking, there's no font called or named after the rivers here in Kenya, for example. So I was so quick to say, I want this font to be called Tana River or Athi River. So I think in a world where I can do that with you, Jantina, I will have a font named Jantina, for instance. Slowly but surely, because that's what's really near me or near us. Then maybe the other part of your question that I also face the challenge on is funding. Funding and research on this work is very expensive. It's exhaustive. It's also marred by the patriarchy we experience every day. So you can imagine if you follow the work by Timnit. Then you'll see she served as an engineer, but she ended up being a social justice engineer in a big tech company, and then folded and opened up her own research institute. So from running the research institute by herself and together with friends and people who think like her, she's been able to put out research and work that is also quite elaborative and imaginative, and it's being used now to form policies and shape some policies in different parts of the world. And a good example would be a country like Australia, who have the E-Safety Commission. In a world where we never thought, if for those of us who do a lot of work on technology facilitated gender-based violence, I would never even think of how to speak about this work to a president. The Australia government is able to set up a whole commission, is able to even have age restrictions when it comes to use of social media apps and mobile phones. So slowly but surely, in a very different way and in a very imaginative way. And I hope to have a font named Jantina after I come up with a very clear solution. Thank you. It was a good question.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to quickly chime in as well to Irene's point about one of the things that emerged from like my interactions with African feminist technologists who are building alternatives. And I don't even like to use the word alternative because alternative implies a deviation from the center. And so when they're building different visions, we come across a lot of examples of how they bump against this structure. So for instance, Andara Mola is creating a new social media. And why did she create that new social media? She found out that there was a wave of anti-queerness, anti-transness on, you know, Twitter and all of this public social medias. And she realized we need a new way to be in relation with each other. And so I'm going to create a new, different kind of social media. I'm going to create a social media. What would it mean if, as a Yoruba woman, I'm incorporating all my aesthetics as a Yoruba woman into this platform? And that's how Neno was built. Neno itself draws from a Swahili word. And so it's talking about what we are saying about relation, where Neno and our own digital platform itself is named Pariwo, Pariwo being a Yoruba word for speak out loud. And so, but even with all of this reimagination is great, but you bump against these structures. I also, she talks about how being in a space like Silicon Valley, working in Silicon Valley and having these aspirations and being tagged the weird social justice lady. And, you know, we're also bringing another technologies from Zambia who is trying to do this work of countering reproductive surveillance and build a different technology. But you still need to put this application on Google Play Store and Apple Play Store. And then you get, you know, you are stuck in a loophole of corporate legibility, and then you're trying to get a registration DUNS number. You can't get it for months. And it's not even just the big tech that is complicit in this structure. It's also our governments themselves who just, you know, want you in a place to just check a box and say, you know, we did this and that's it. And so a lot of African feminist technologies are doing the work without the power, without the funds to do so. But still, there's something I always come to, and there's this quote by, it was Toni Morrison that said it. She said, I stood at the border, stood at the edge and claimed it as central, and the rest of the world moved over to where I was. And that's what I'm seeing with what people like Andara Mola and Ololade in Zambia are doing, where they are recreating their own, you know, they're moving away from, it's not an aspiration to join the center. They're stepping away from it and creating the spaces on the margins and tangible spaces, you know, and people are engaging on these spaces. People are engaging with the applications they are creating, and they are recreating the center. And the task for us is we should pay attention. And so I think, to your point, reimagination will always bump against, but we can choose to find different solutions in each other and different ways to relate with each other by engaging with the spaces as they have done.
Thanks to both of you. Lovely reflections and responses. Thank you.
Thank you both. I really appreciate that last, I guess, invitation to recreate the center at the margins, and a lot of the relational values that you've foregrounded, like care, like solidarity, hope, I think are resonating quite a bit with the audience. So thank you for that invitation. Are there any questions? Just please raise your hand. I hope I haven't missed anything in the chat. I think there is a comment in the chat about with someone struggling with the provocation you made about what technologies would look like if they took as their center, if they were made by a woman who had to walk distances to get water. Cholo, maybe you could just say a few words on the comment or provocation or your thought, your thinking behind the question you've put down. Okay, sorry about that. But I mean, Ololade, Irene, if you had a moment to take a look, I don't know if you want to say a few words.
I'm trying to read the question so I can I think, yes. So if I understand your question, what you're trying to tease is what would these technologies look like? Would it be from the very algorithm to the force code and all of these things, and what would that technology look like? So case in point, and this is not even in the African context, it's in Chile, and Google wanted to create a data center in Chile. Now, Chile was experiencing, that space was experiencing a water drought. Now, but data centers need water. But they decided they were going to create a data center in a place that has a water drought. Creating a data center that requires mass volumes of water, when the everyday people in Chile cannot even, are struggling to find water. And so that, in a way, answers that question of, if it was a Chilean technologist that wanted to create a technology, that wanted to create a data center in that space, will they find alternative ways of cooling data centers that don't require water because they are Chilean and they understand what it means to be in a space of water drought? And what does it mean that Google decided to create that data center in that place with large disregard for the people living there who are struggling with water, while their data center was consuming mass volumes of water? And so that is one example, but it also begs the call for, if a lot of the technologies that we create were created with us in mind. And I'd given a couple of examples of, and Holland realized women were being surveilled. And so with that in mind, I'm going to create a new way of period tracking that is not built on surveillance. Queer women are being chased off the internet, and I'm going to build a new social media so that queer women can be in relation with each other without having to be fearful of, tech violence, And so it's the core of imagination. And this is something that even plagues us as being on an African continent beyond technology, of when you close your eyes and you think of modernity, whose modernity do you dream of? Whose modernity can you think of? And if it's not your modernity, then we're fundamentally wounded people who are walking about this world without healing those wounds. And so what this question is basically getting us to is, how can we heal ourselves and think of ways to do things differently that stem from, to what Irene has said, care, thinking about ourselves and our neighbors and, our people, and absolutely not doing things strictly in service of capital, but in ways that are communal, that are, So I hope I answered that question as best as I can.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to invite Melinda to pose a question. I think you just need to unmute.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed, I think, every aspect of it. So just a brief background about me. My name is Melinda and I'm from Zimbabwe, currently living in Rwanda. And I have like a master's degree in AI. So I'm one of the people who are like very interested in I know how to build the models. I understand what we are doing, right? Like from a technology end of things, like the developer side of things. However, at the same time, recently I just got interested in the policies around technology in general, like mostly imaging technologies, right? Because what I noticed is that there's always this idea where most African countries are just consuming technology. And the problem is we are using technology that comes from somewhere else. And we were never considered in the decision making. We were never considered when all of these things were made. I think it comes back to the example you gave about Chile. Like they're trying to build something, but the people who are going to use it are not even considered in that. And this is one of the things that I'm actually really interested in, like just the research around how can we make sure that the global south is not just exploited in using these technologies. And at the same time, like I said, coming from a technologist end of things, I understand that it is very expensive for us to also think that we can just be building solutions on our own. So it's more of like, I don't know if I really have a question, it's more of like a comment, to be honest, but it's about how can we balance it off? How can we use these technologies to advance our countries? Because honestly, we need to be on the bandwagon with everyone. But at the same time, how do we ensure that our people are not exploited? We are not exploited in the process, because when we get exploited, nothing happens. Like all of the action suits, like the class action suits that are filed, they benefit people in countries that have proper legislation, which we mostly do not have around technology, right? So I would say, maybe just to cut my long story short, it's one of the things that we probably need to consider as Africans. How can we make sure that the legislation is there to serve us? Because technology doesn't really have boundaries, but at the same time, like our legislation has boundaries, it has borders. So now we need to find that balance. Like, are we going to engage with our governments to ensure that they also put the people first? Are we going to think about putting more funding in our own research, so that maybe we say we want to have our own Facebook and not use Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook because it's exploiting us? So it's just like one of those things that I really enjoyed the conversation, because I think I'm in a space with people who really understand something that has been like on my mind. And also, I'm actually looking to pursue a PhD in policy making, mostly for technology. So thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Melinda. Irene, maybe, I see you want to respond.
Yeah, so Melinda, you've made a presentation about what I was trying to do earlier on. I was just trying to move away from the usual Africa Union language, but you said rightfully so, you're a techie, you're a builder, you have a master's in AI. Thank God, and you're an African woman, amen. So I hope we can even name a program after you. So I hope to keep and remember your name in future, because that's how we continue again, the imagination, the technologies that serve us, they should be named after you. But just to tell you on a very general regard, when you're building your artificial intelligence work and tools, and if you're an African, then you need laws that serve you. Africa Union, the ACHPR, that's the Africa Commission level, is now exploring digital studies to understand what is the role of technologists and what's happening, especially on the technologists side. And in those digital studies, there's also been 30-year-long work about access to data. I think we're the only continent in the world who cannot claim that we own our data. Our data sovereignty still is quote unquote, but even when some of these big tech companies want to build data centers in our countries, our governments are yet to build robust data centers and for data ethnography to happen in our own countries, in our own accord, in our own style, in our own standard, and all that and all that. But Melinda, just to tell you, in terms of policy advocacy, good that you're pursuing, and you hope to get into that from a PhD perspective. There's some good work happening. If you want to join some of the email groups, I am happy to have a conversation with you going forward. But I put in the chat 2 examples, one on image-based policy work that is now being used to really stop child sexual exploitation and human trafficking, especially of adult women here in Africa who especially work in the adult content industry. A lot of your images, videos, always taken to pirated websites, and sometimes that content is used to spot them, pick them from their houses or from their communities, and even have them move to other continents for work in very exploitative models. So sometimes when you find images, videos, or content that is unwanted on some of these apps, the work that has been done on this, Melinda, it's not robust as we would all want, but you have to report those images because some of the tools we use are encrypted and they're not able to access. Once you report, then even the police in your country are able to follow and track and support with any redress mechanisms. But when it comes to image-based work, especially on the sexual exploitation side, you can go and read at that website. And in Kenya, the Kenya government did some work during the election with some data scientists and the National Commission here in Kenya to identify keywords that are used to bring hate during elections, which are everyday words, as you know how this happens. But again, that's from a policy on social cohesion here in Kenya and the right to dignity in our guaranteed in our constitution. So very much so, even when it feels like our policies are not there yet, they're still being used one or another. We are not at zero. I hate to use this example, but when you use an Uber rating, we are somewhere. We are somewhere on the 5-star, almost on the 5-star, even when we do not have our own tech companies, our own big data centers. We are doing some few things here and there. Thank you.
Thanks, Irene. Do we have any final questions? If not, I will try see how I can bring everything to a close. I mean, yeah. Thank you, Ololade and Irene. I think that was a really wide-ranging and very rich discussion. And I just want to I guess, offer my own quick comments about what I mean, my sense of the journey that you took us into. I think, the standout question is, a very broad one about the position of Africa in global network mediated by AI, or just what is the position of Africa in global discourses of science and innovation, I think. And sort of you hone that down into, thinking about at least trying to answer that question from the vantage point of African women. And so I want to both recognize the move to foreground experiences of the different your efforts to link women's experiences across the extractivist relations in the AI stack. But something that also struck me that I perhaps wish we got into a little bit more is that I think it was you, Irene, who was talking about, it's not just a theory of suffering, that the space, whether we are focusing on the continent or the diaspora, is itself generative of alternative futures, alternative ways of relating. And I sort of wanted to acknowledge that. Something that I think is at risk of going under the radar is it's even the mode of relationality that you and Irene have gestured at in sort of in the dynamic between the two of you. I think Ololade pointing to the idea that perhaps this kind of work needs us to destabilize the traditional research subject dynamic. I mean, and I think there's a way in which you've performed that even in this brief encounter that I think is particularly interesting. And I would sort of, at least if we imagine that this webinar is part of an ongoing conversation, it's something that I would like to be in, and I imagine the audience as well would like to be in conversation with you about. I was curious about, in different ways, I think you answered it, but I think a lingering curiosity is the Africa that you're speaking about, especially in moments where there is talk of us. And it's not necessarily a comment about, I'm not doing the usual performance of, oh, let's not be essentialist. It's really not that. It's really just, what is the work that you want the concept of Africa to do, or the idea of Africa to do? What's the political project that you are trying to mobilize and build community around? So it's recognizing that concepts, which I think you do, like concepts like terms like Africa, yes, they name, specific geographies or specific relations of power, but there's also a very sort of active way in which they are repositories or resources with which to build to build the world anew, or to world make, or which is a concept that we are quite invested in here at the lab. And yeah, and so in that regard, I think it's a really profound invitation that you've offered to locate our thinking about AI in an evolving conversation that African feminists have had, both theoretically, but also both practically. in terms of how we make the world anew. So thank you for extending your insights in that conversation that is not new, that trying for situating us, at least helping to situate our thinking in that. And I'll leave it at that. I think it was very rich and generative, and I think a lot of it I'm excited to see what future conversations might have in store. I don't know. I'll before I give you give you both the last word, I would like to mention that in the chat room there are some resources provided by yourself and Ololade, and I've also just posted a link to our next webinar, a final webinar of the year, which is going to be on the environmental dimensions of AI infrastructures, particularly in terms of environmental waste, with Samuel Moses Ntapata from Tanzania. And I've also posted a link to the broad range of activities that we host here at the Ethics Lab to foster some of these conversations. So you can treat that as an invitation to participate in our webinars as a speaker, but also to apply for some of our other activities like our residencies and retreats and small project funding. So on that note, I'd like to hand over to Irene and Ololade again. I'm expressing my thanks once more, and yeah, just giving you the opportunity to close us off with your
So Irene has to go, and so because she has like an interview right now, and so I am gonna round off so we don't keep Irene staying. Irene, bye.
I can't wait to see fonts named after all of us. Bye.
Okay. But to just quickly round off and speak to Anye's point, thank you so much for having us. This is an emerging conversation. This is my own, this links directly to my own doctoral work. And so it's a work in progress of, what does a different vision of technology look like from the, work of African women that we can see in concrete terms on the margins. And this is a lot of conversation, especially because I'm currently doing that PhD in Emory. And so you get a lot of conversation about, are you being essentialist by wrapping Africa all in one? And I always push back by saying that this is a moment in time where the encounters of technology with the continent forces us into the group shared experience of digital colonialism, and the work that emerges from that, from people who are thinking about different visions and not thinking about it as a nation state bounded project. They are thinking about it on the scale of the continent, and we should encounter them on that vision, and so because of that, Africa becomes this political a term that we use as a way to think about relation, where, for instance, we had mentioned that in the beginning that content moderators in Kenya are not only Kenyans, they're from all over being brought to do this work. And the precarity that comes from that, where you're stuck in a work that you're surveilled, you do not have visas to go back home, they keep you essentially bounded to big tech to do this work. And so this is something we should pay a lot of attention. So we hear a lot of conversation about how, ChatGPT is making our lives easier. There's a lot of anxiety about being a teacher in this space as well. But if we are using a technology and we realize that the only reason why we can have the data labeled to use this technology is because there's some African people, African women and men in a underground, what's it called? In a what's the word? In a garage somewhere doing this work, underpaid, debilitated, then it should scare us. We should open this application and close it and shout out loud to the world and say, this is wrong. If what we're thinking about technology requires harming African people, then this is something that, we should rethink how we engage with this. And this is a work that, unfortunately, we don't have the support of the state. And so it's, like I said before, on the margins. But we keep thinking, we don't give up, we keep reimagining, and hopefully we can shift the center to our margins. But thank you again, Anye. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for joining us. This webinar will be archived on our website, and you'll be made aware of that to share, and we'll also sort of write some initial reflections about some of these provocations. But I hope this is the first of many more engagements. And Ololade and Irene, thank you so much again for giving us your time and sharing your insights. So thank you all, and yeah, see you all again at some point in the future.